I love it. The kids, as they're going through the Gospel Project curriculum, at this moment in the church calendar, they are just 1 week off from where we are. So they're going through Judges as we are going through Judges. So this week, they're going to be looking at the story of Gideon, which we looked at last week. So I love how the kids and the parents are able to dialogue around these stories in the book of Judges. And great stories they are. Who here would consider yourself a movie buff? Who likes to go to the movies? Watch movies at home and so on. Now, over the last, I think it's 15 years now, there's been this onslaught of superhero movies, right? I mean, I think we're north of 40, I think. Many superhero movies. And did you know that a lot of these movies find their inspiration in the book of Judges? Stan Lee, the founder of Marvel, grew up in a Jewish community in New York, and the story of the Judges were often taken and morphed and molded to turn into some of these superhero movies that we see today, which seems like they come out every month. And they're breaking records, right? They come out and it's like, man, they make more money than the last one. And recently, there's a movie that came out that was different than the rest. Usually with the superhero movies, we look at Iron Man, or we look at Captain America or Hulk or whoever it is, and you have this great movie of the hero and then the villain that comes in and they fight each other. Right? That's basically every superhero movie, except recently a movie came out about a villain. Right? It's the movie Joker, which came out last year, and it likewise broke all sorts of records for an R-rated superhero movie. If you watch this movie, it starts in a bad place and it just gets worse with this character, Joker, right? And what this movie does, it offers fans of the Batman series a backstory to the Joker that people wondered about. Where did this character come from? So you have this villain that is focused in for this entire movie in the Joker. Well, likewise, in the book of Judges, we have stories of these heroes of the faith, right? We've looked at Othniel, we've looked at Ehud, we've looked at Deborah, we've looked at Gideon, and then there's villains such as Eglon and Adonai-Bezek and Sisera and the sons of Anak, all of these villains that fight against the heroes. And then we come to chapter 9, and the mood changes. Much like the Joker movie in the superhero genre, chapter 9 of Judges focuses in on a villain, on an anti-judge, on a serpent figure himself. And like the movie Joker, which offered a backstory, there's also a backstory to Abimelech that we have to understand in order to understand chapter 9, which tells us about the life of this villain, this anti-hero, this anti-judge, Abimelech. And the backstory to Abimelech goes back to the life of Gideon, and in particular to his failure at the end of his life. We looked at Gideon last week, and he had this great life of faithful service to the Lord. God strengthened him. He was doubtful, he was fearful, but through God's strength and spirit, he rose to the occasion, right? Now, the last few verses in chapter 8 actually tell us about the last days of Gideon's life. And unfortunately, Gideon did not finish well, right? Did not finish well. And one thing that we're tempted to do when we read a story about somebody in the Bible who fails is we want to just kind of throw them out and say, yeah, see, here's another failure in the Bible, another judge that does evil before the Lord. However, that's not how the Bible remembers Gideon. In fact, we look at chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, the Hall of Faith, and Gideon is listed as one of the heroes of the faith. Even in the book of Judges itself, it talks about how Israel forgot all that Gideon had done for them, right? So though he failed, God still used him, and he is still to be looked at as a hero in the faith. So the end of Gideon's life offers us the backstory of Abimelech, the villain we'll look at this morning. Do you remember near the end of Gideon's life, after he had conquered the enemies, the people of Israel come to him and ask him to be their king? Right? We see this in chapter 8, verses 22 and 23. It says that the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." And Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Right? Gideon he doesn't want to take the place of a king that Israel wanted him to take. Right? He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Neither will my son, for the Lord is our king. Yahweh is our king. We serve him. We follow him. He is to rule over us. So these great, powerful words of Gideon, if the story ended there, it would have ended with thumbs up. Like, yes, Gideon, you ended well. However, what we see happening from there is Gideon began to actually believe his own hype, right? I mean, he was a very influential person. Everybody looked up to him. He was a judge. And they wanted him to be king. And he said, no, I'm not going to be king. But eventually he started believing, maybe I should be king. And he began to live almost as if he were a king. He started to believe his own fame. And part of his failures, he made an ephod, which is the piece on the high priest's uniform that they would learn the will of God. He made one of those, a big one, and put it in the city, and the people treated it as an idol. And not only that, but he broke God's law, and he took many wives for himself. And he had many kids with these wives and these concubines. And in fact, the backstory of Gideon is connected, or the backstory of Abimelech is connected to Gideon because Abimelech is one of Gideon's kids. And Gideon named Abimelech, gave him his name, which means my father is king. Right? So Gideon actually thinks of himself as a king and names his son Abimelech, which means my father is king. However, but with all of Gideon's failures, perhaps the greatest, the most grievous, is that he neglected his duties as a father. He failed as a father. In our world today, families are the foundation of society, and fathers are the cornerstone of a family to guide and to direct the direction of the family. As goes the father, so goes the family, and as goes the family, so goes the culture and society. And this universal truth is testified to in the scriptures, and we see that here in the life of Gideon and Abimelech. So what we see at the end of Gideon's life is a man who fails to finish well, and one of the most disastrous ways he fails is as a father. Look with me at verses 29 and 30 of Judges chapter 8. Jerubbabel, this is Gideon. Remember, he was given this name when he tore down the altars of Baal early on in his life. And Jerubbabel means I contend with Baal, or in our language we would call it Baal fighter, right? Gideon is the Baal fighter. Jerubbabel, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. So it says here, man, he had 70 sons because he had many wives. But what we want to look at is verse 29, where it says that he went and he lived in his own house. In other words, he went and he lived by himself. He's got multiple wives and concubines. He's got 70 sons, and who knows how many daughters. And instead of being a faithful father to his sons and daughters, instead of discipling them, instead of disciplining them, instead of teaching them the law, showing them how to walk faithfully before Yahweh, what does he do? He's like, I can't handle it. He goes and he lives by himself. He becomes an absent father. And he might travel around to the different houses and to visit his kids, have a dinner here or there. And one of the places he would have traveled would have been to Shechem, which is like a suburb, or it's outside of Jerusalem. So he goes to Shechem because he had a concubine there and a son. Look at verse 31. It says, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. All right, so this is our villain. This is the serpent figure of this chapter 9. And he is a son of Gideon, who was born in Shechem by one of his wives or one of his concubines. So Gideon would have gone and met him and so on. But out of all the sons, only two are named in the story. One is here Abimelech, and another we'll be introduced to in a little while. But Abimelech is the key figure in all of chapter 9. So who was this guy? Who was Abimelech? Well, he was part Canaanite and part Hebrew. Right? Abimelech's mom in Shechem was a Baal-worshiping Canaanite, which also testifies to Gideon's failure as far as having wives that are not worshipers of Yahweh. So his mother lived in Shechem, a Baal-worshiping Canaanite. So Abimelech was actually part Canaanite and part Hebrew. And this is also what he leads Israel into in worship, that he leads them to worship Baal Berith, which is a mixture of Canaanite religion and worship of Yahweh. Bring them together, Baal Berith. Berith is the Hebrew word for covenant. And as we know, Yahweh is the God of the covenant, right? He makes covenants with his people. So they take some of Yahweh's worship and the law and they mix it with some Canaanite religion, and you have this new form of Baal worship, Baal Berith. It's kind of like what Mormonism has done, right? You take some aspects of the truth of the gospel, Jesus, God, Spirit, and then you take some modern day Baalism and you mix them together and you come up with something like Mormonism. So here he is leading Israel into this Baal worship that mixes worship with Yahweh. So again, Abimelech is the main villain. He's a serpent figure of the story. And in the past, the serpents have slithered into the garden of Israel from outside. But in this story, the serpent was born in the garden. He's always been in the garden, right? So when Israel has sinned, God has handed Israel over to foreign nations for discipline, as we have seen with the Moabites and the Amalekites and so on. But this time, Israel has gotten into such a bad place that God doesn't need to hand them over to anybody. He just hands them over to themselves. Says, you have spiraled out of control so badly that all I have to do is step back and you will punish yourselves. And part of the way they punish themselves is by anointing Abimelech as their king. All right, so as we move to chapter 9, we see that Gideon has died, and the people begin to wonder what to do. In fact, they don't really wonder what to do. They know what to do, and they want to worship Baal. Look at verse 33 of chapter 8. It says, as soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. As soon as Gideon died. Right? It doesn't say a time after or after a while they fell into. It was almost like, man, Gideon, he is the one that's holding this whole family together. And as soon as he dies, we're out of here. We're going back to what we want to do. My grandmother played that sort of role in my family's life. As she was living, everybody kind of held it together relationally, my aunts and my uncles and so on. But when she died, it was almost like the family just began to argue and to fight, and there's been broken relationships and pain since she passed away. And this sort of thing happens, right? We want to honor our leaders, honor your grandmother, or honor Gideon by not worshiping Baal in front of him. But once he dies, we're going straight for it. And this is exactly what Israel has done. So Gideon dies, Israel turns back to Baal worship. They have forgotten all the good that Gideon has done, and they've forgotten the powerful works of Yahweh on their behalf. And they have once again fully submerged themselves back into Baal worship. And Gideon's son, Abimelech, is the one who rises up to be the primary oppressor of Israel. And he has risen up from within Israel. So we see his story beginning in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Look with me there as I read. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, Baal fighter, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am bone and your flesh, right? So he lays this out. He says, all right, Gideon has died. He was the ruler. He was the judge. He's the one that people followed. Now that he's gone, is it better for you that the 70 sons of Gideon, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, they all rule over you? Or would it be better that just one, yours truly? And don't forget, we're family, right? I'm from here. My mom's here. Wouldn't it be better that I rule over you than these 70 sons of Jerubbaal, the Baal fighter, right? We like to worship Baal here in Shechem, and I'm for it, says Abimelech. I'm all for Baal worship, but if the 70 sons of the Baal fighter, if he comes in, then they're going to try to wipe this out. It's like, but I'll promote it. So he begins to try to persuade them to make him king. And the word spreads throughout Shechem that Abimelech desires to be king, and he gains support from the city. And we see the support given in verse 4. It says, and they gave him, that is the leaders of Shechem, they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. So you have Abimelech saying, I want to be the ruler. They say, okay, yeah, we'll follow you. In fact, we can't follow you as king unless you have an army. So here's 70 pieces of silver. Go and get yourself an army. So he does. He takes it and he goes and he purchases 70 freelance thugs to do his business for him, right? His contesting of anybody who might want to threaten him. So now he's got his men, he's got a little army. What is Abimelech to do if he wants the throne? Well, he wants to take out any threat to the throne, as any good tyrant would do. If you have a claim on the throne, I want you gone, right? So he goes back to Ophrah, where Gideon's house, and his 70 brothers are there. Now, the fact that Gideon or Abimelech's 70 brothers, the 70 sons of Gideon, are all in one place, which is strange because they were spread out before, actually alludes to the fact that Gideon probably had just died and they're at his house mourning him for the funeral. That's why they would all be in one place. So as soon as Gideon dies, Abimelech goes to Shechem and says, now's the time. Do you want all of them to rule over you or do you want me? They say, we want you. So they give him the money. He gets his guys. He goes back to Gideon's house, and funerals were multiple days long. He goes back to his house where his 70 brothers are mourning the death of their father, and he sees them as a threat to his throne. So what does he do? Look with me at verse 5. It says, and he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Zerubbabel, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Zerubbabel, was left, for he hid himself. So the sons of Gideon were here mourning the death of their father, and Abimelech comes in with his new army, his newly acquired army, rounds them up and slaughters all of his brothers. And the fact that it says that they slaughtered them or killed them on one stone is significant. And this actually alludes to the fact that he took his brothers and made them as human sacrifices to Baal. Upon a stone is like an altar sort of picture. So here you have Abimelech sacrificing his 70 brothers, slaughtering them upon a stone as a sacrifice to Baal. So now, this Baal-worshiping serpent king has himself an army. He's wiped out his 70 brothers, the ones that might have claim to the throne, and wants to rule as king. This is a grotesque picture, right? I mean, this man Abimelech is evil from top to bottom. He just killed his 70 brothers because he wants power and because he's ensnared to sin. See, the story of Abimelech actually paints for us a picture of what it looks like to give into your sin without any restraint. If you're handed over to your sin, you look like Abimelech, right? As sin takes root in our hearts, it actually turns our affections away from God and away from people to that which is evil. The same way it happened with Abimelech. When sin takes root in our hearts, we tend to lash out at one another. Right? This is what sin does. It hates community. It wants you alone. It sees everyone as a threat. We think we need to protect ourselves from those who love us. Sin causes us to think that everyone is against us and that people want to hurt us. Sin isolates us from our brothers and sisters, and if it's not dealt with, we end up viewing everyone who loves us as our enemies. We see this in the story with Cain and Abel. Sin takes root in Cain's heart, and he sees his brother as his enemy. He hates his brother, and he kills his brother. We see this in the life of Saul. As sin takes root in Saul's life and becomes prideful, he sees David as a threat. And he tries, unsuccessfully, to kill David for it by throwing a spear at him. And here we see it with Abimelech. Sin takes root in his heart, and he views all of his brothers not as brothers, right? Not as family, but as enemies. And he rounds them up and slaughters each and every one. Church, sin will take you further into the darkness than you ever thought possible. It will. Sin will turn you against your friends who love you. Sin will turn you against your family. Sin will turn you against your church. Sin will turn you against your Savior. This is what sin does. It causes you to lose your mind. It causes you to be delusional, and you don't see things rightly. This is one of the main reasons we must confess our sins when we gather with each other. This is why if we have problems with one another, we go and we confess to one another, as the scriptures say. Because if we leave sin alone, it will grow into something that will devour us. As the Puritan John Owen said, it says, be killing sin or sin will be killing you. Right? Be killing sin or sin will be killing you. And Abimelech did not kill sin. And therefore sin began to kill him and everyone around him. So Abimelech kills his 70 brothers, except for Jotham, the youngest, because he hid himself when he saw Abimelech come in doing what he was doing. He found a good place to hide so he was not sacrificed. And then after he sacrifices his 70 brothers, as human sacrifices, the leaders of Shechem come together. We see this in verse 6. It says, and all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech their king by the oak of the pillar of Shechem. So after a human sacrifice of Abimelech's 70 brothers, the 70 sons of Gideon, the leaders of Shechem anoint Abimelech as their king. This is Israel's first king. We often think that Saul is the first one. He's the first in the kingly dynasties that God was supportive of. But Abimelech is the first king in Israel's history, and it's a kingship that is birthed out of the blood of human sacrifice. His kingship is a demonic kingship. He is a serpent figure, a demonic king. And now he is anointed king by the leaders of Shechem. He has finally gotten what he wanted. Now, word gets out about his anointing and the fact that he's now the new king. And Jotham, his younger brother, hears. He hears about what took place at Shechem and Beth Millo, where they anointed his brother as king, and he is compelled to speak. So what does Jotham do? He travels to Shechem to speak to the leaders. Now this might mean death for him. However, he does so. He travels there. He has something to say because he knows what sort of king Abimelech is and will be. So he travels there, and we see this in verses 7 through 15. And this part of the story is a beautiful little section where Jotham goes, and the speech he gives, he speaks to them in a parable or an allegory. A lot of people call it Jotham's fable. And it's this beautiful little picture right in the middle of chapter 9. So I want us to look at this fable, Jotham's fable, what he speaks to the leaders in Shechem. It says this in verse 7. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. Right? Already he's speaking with a prophetic voice. Right? You listen to me if you want God to listen to you. And then he goes on to tell them this fable. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? They didn't like that answer. So the trees went to the fig tree. And in verse 10, and the trees said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? And finally, the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you're coming to me, you're anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. All right, so you have this little fable here that Jotham tells. And the fable tells of these trees that are desiring a king. The trees, of course, are paralleled with Israel and their desire for the same. The trees go to the olive tree and then to the fig tree and then to the vine looking for a king. But each of the three trees already have a king. It's their creator. They know their role. They know who their king is. And each of the three trees understand their role and their purpose in life. The olive tree produces oil that's used to anoint kings and priests. And so he uses his oil to serve both God and man. God first, then men. Likewise, the fig tree produces sweetness for the pleasure of God and man. God first, and then man. And then finally, the vine produces wine that would bring joy to both God and man. Each of the trees know their purpose and their calling, and they are not looking to step outside of that. So the trees, unsatisfied with the rejection of the olive and the fig and the vine, they go to the bramble. And they ask the bramble, will you rule over us? The bramble produces nothing good in life. The bramble is a thorny plant, and thus it is a symbol of the curse of the ground. We see this in Genesis 3, that the ground will wage war against man, right? It pushes against, it doesn't want to be cultivated. And the bramble is a symbol of the curse, right? So you have the trees going to the bramble, the symbol of the curse, wanting it to rule over them. But the bramble offers nothing to the society. It produces nothing. It grows along the ground, and it demands that all the other trees take shelter in its shade. And that sort of demand is completely ridiculous when you think about it, because the bramble is this thorny plant that grows on the ground. So for a fig tree to take shelter in the shade of the bramble, the fig tree must come down, right? For the olive tree to take shelter in the shade of the bramble, it must come down. For the vine, it must come down. And if these trees come down, they lose all of their purpose. They lose their fruitfulness. They are no longer able to please God and man as their king, their creator, has created them. But this is what the bramble demands. It demands that if I am to rule over, all the trees must take shelter under my shade. The bramble is a tyrant. It's abusive. And it would happily see all the trees destroyed as long as it is king. And if the bramble becomes king over the trees, he will destroy everyone. And any that do not bow down before him, he will send out fire to devour the trees, including the mighty cedars of Lebanon. So Jotham tells them this fable, warning them. And then he goes on to tell them, now, if you have, with a good heart and integrity, truthful before God, honoring Gideon and his family, if because of all of this you have anointed Abimelech to be your king, then rejoice in him. Rejoice in him as the fig tree rejoices in its sweetness, or as the vine rejoices in its wine, right? Rejoice in your king, and let Abimelech rejoice in you as well. However, that's not what happened. Then he goes on to say, I was there when he slayed my 70 brothers. You gave him 70 pieces of silver. You have not, with good integrity and trust and honor before Gideon, before God, you have not anointed Abimelech as your king with good intentions. Therefore, you will be cursed. And he gives them the curse in verse 20. It says, but if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. So here, Jotham is cursing both Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, right, for the abuse and the evil they have done. And this curse upon Abimelech and Shechem is actually what frames and directs the rest of the story. And it is a curse that God stands behind. It is a curse that God will see come to fruition. We see God's activity in this in verses 22 and 23. It says that Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years, right? So the whole story of Abimelech is a 3-year reign from his anointing to the end of his life. And God sent an evil spirit. God did this. He sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. And the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Right? So right after this, God sends a spirit to cause tension, to cause strife, to cause fighting between Abimelech and Shechem. Right? Shechem's thinking, man, we made the investment of 70 pieces of silver for you to get going, and now we have a problem with you. Abimelech likewise says, Shechem, you have a problem with me, I have a problem with you. So there's tension here. Now, there's a character that pops up in this story named Gaal, right? G-A-A-L, Gaal. And Gaal is a very powerful, persuasive, probably a charming sort of man. And he and his family move to Shechem. And he begins to get in good with the leaders of Shechem, who now are frustrated with Abimelech. All right, so he gets in good with them, and he goes out into the field. He's picking grapes with them. And then they say, hey, let's go back to the bar, and let's throw a couple back, essentially is what they do. They go back, and they start drinking, and they get drunk. And Gaal begins to run his mouth, right? He begins to run his mouth. We see this in verses 28 and 29. The son of Gaal, or Gaal, son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech, right? Who is this guy? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him, right? I don't care about them. Is not he the son of Jerubbaal, the Baal fighter? And is not Zebul his officer? Now Zebul is still there in Shechem. He says, serve the men of Hamor and the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Talking about Abimelech. Then he says, would that this people were under my hand, then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come on out, right? Come on out, Abimelech, increase your army, come to war. If I was to deal with him, I'll just wipe him out. Now, Zebul is still friends with Abimelech. He is his officer, and he's there, and he overhears Gaal talking this trash about Abimelech. So he sends a message to Abimelech, and he says, hey, listen, there's a new family in town. There's a new guy, Gaal, and he is stirring the people up against you. He's riling them up, and he wants to be the leader. And Abimelech wants nothing of that. Says, no way. This guy is not going to come and challenge me. And what we find out is that Gaal asked for more than he was ready for. Abimelech hears this word, and he decides to go back to Shechem and teach Gaal a lesson. And Gaal had no idea what he was in for. Now, by this time, Abimelech, this serpent figure, has grown. He's gone from that small serpent to now being a dragon, a great dragon, an evil dragon. So Abimelech comes back with his army. Gaal goes out to fight him. And in no time, Gaal comes up to fight him, and then he sees him. He goes, I'm out. And he runs away. He's like, I'm not doing it, right? He had no idea how seriously evil Abimelech was. And he goes to fight him and goes, I can't do this. And he gets scared and he runs. And he takes his family with him and he's out of town. Abimelech now turns his eyes to Shechem. Says, you wanted to have a new leader. And they already have a problem. God has orchestrated tension between them. And he says, all right, now it's your turn. He turns his eyes to Shechem, and he and his army go into the city, and he starts slaughtering people. The people of Shechem are unable to withstand his onslaught. So they run and they hide in the tower of Shechem. Now, the tower of Shechem is a stronghold. It was connected to the temple of Baal. So you have all of these people going into this tower, all the leaders, men, women, children. They all go into this tower hoping that Abimelech and his army will just leave because they can't get into the tower. And Abimelech knows that. However, this dragon has another tactic. So he takes an axe and he goes and he chops down some wood. He creates a bundle and he begins to carry it, and he tells his whole army, do what I did, right? As you've seen me do, you do this yourself. Sounds like Gideon here, right? Remember, Gideon does that with his army. So all of his army grabs their axes. They cut down these bushes of firewood, kindling essentially, and they go and they lay it around the tower. So if you won't come out, that's fine. And Abimelech lights it, and he torches the entire tower. And he burns over 1,000 people alive. This man is an absolute monster. He destroys Shechem with fire. Now, it's interesting that Jotham talked about this. Jotham said, may fire come out from Abimelech and destroy you. So now Shechem has received their punishment. They have received their part of the prophecy. However, Abimelech is still standing. So that leaves us to wonder, well, what about Abimelech? When is he going to be destroyed? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. So he burns this tower with 1,000 people, thus wiping out Shechem and all of its people. He then turns his eyes to Thebez, which is like a suburb of Shechem. He says, let's go there. So they travel down to Thebez, and they start slaughtering people there. And the people, again, they get scared. They start to run. They go to the tower. They lock themselves in because this is the stronghold. This is where they're safe, they think. And Abimelech says, well, I know what to do here. So he gathers wood, and he goes, I'll burn them down too. And at this time, the people who go into the tower, they climb up to the roof. And from the roof, they might even see the smoke billowing from Shechem still, from that tower, perhaps. And they say, oh my goodness. And they look down and over the edge, and they see Abimelech stacking wood near the door, getting ready to burn it down. And they say, oh my goodness, what are we to do? And this is where the story takes a drastic turn, right? You can imagine all of these people up on the roof, panicking, wondering what to do, and then something happens. Look with me at verse 53. It says, and a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. There it is, right? Could you imagine all of these people looking down, freaking out because they're about to light us on fire, and this one woman, she looks around and she grabs a millstone, which was pretty good size. She goes, move out of my way, right? They look, they throw it down, and everybody kind of looks over the edge. Bow. Yeah, we got him. Yes, victory. And it crushed his skull. Now, Abimelech is very close to death at this point. But he's got enough in him to make one last request. So in 54, it says this, then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. So once again, what we have in this story is a woman crushing the head of a serpent figure. Same way Jael crushed the head of Sisera, and the same way it was prophesied in the garden that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Same way Christ crushes the head of Satan, sin, and death upon the cross. We have yet again this other woman who crushes the head of this serpent figure. Now, what I love about this verse, 54, is that there is this beautiful irony and poetic justice going on here. Now, the irony is that if you ask anybody, who killed Abimelech? Well, the woman did, all right? The woman who threw the stone. That's how he died. That's his legacy, which is the very thing he wanted to not be the case, right? So in his fear, his legacy ends up being, you were slayed by a woman. She crushed your head with a millstone. So that's the irony of it. Then there's some poetic justice because if you look at how Abimelech died, he died by a stone and a sword, which is the same way he killed his 70 brothers back at Gideon's funeral. So here we see that the prophecy is fulfilled when Abimelech burns Shechem to the ground. The fire came out of Abimelech. And now we see the prophecy fulfilled when the woman destroys Abimelech. Now, the prophecy said it would be fire, right? But one of the awesome things is that this is a nameless woman. It just says a woman. In Hebrew, it's an Isha. And Isha killed him. Ish is woman, Hebrew for woman. Ish is woman is Hebrew for fire. So you have this connection with women and fire all throughout the Bible. So here, I think this is very intentional that you have this fire woman, this woman who is fire, drop the stone and kill Abimelech, thus likewise being destroyed by fire. This is a beautiful picture of what Christ has done for us on the cross. Is it not? He crushes the head of the serpent. And after, I don't have the slide for us, but the next verse, once all of Abimelech's men see him there dead, they say, all right, and they all go home, right? War's over. You cut off the head of the serpent, and the snake dies. This is what Christ has accomplished for us upon the cross. Now, the story of Abimelech is one of gruesome gore and fighting and evil from top to bottom. However, the story of Abimelech, this evil villain, this serpent, this dragon, teaches us what it looks like when sin rules over us. When we are left to ourselves, Abimelech is a perfect example of what it looks like when sin rules. We see in this story what it looks like when people cling to the desires that they have that war against God's holiness. It's a story of fig trees and olive trees and grapevines submitting themselves to the rule of a bramble. It's a story of God's people submitting themselves to the rule of Baal and his serpent king. It's a story of the horrifying realities of life when we give ourselves over to sin's rule. This story is a reminder to us all, of what sin does and how it is constantly crouching at the door. Remember the first murder in the Bible with Cain and Abel. When God spoke to Cain, he said, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it, right? Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Church, sin is still crouching at the door. It still has a desire for you, and you still must rule over it. But how can one learn to rule over sin? Sin's power is so strong. It's so demanding. It's so isolating that as soon as it sets its claws in us, how are we to escape? Gideon's seemingly minor sins of a father resulted in his son Abimelech becoming a mass murderer. It resulted in his son becoming not just a serpent, but like a dragon that breathes fire to destroy the people of God. Sin was crouching at the door of Gideon's family, and he did not rule over it. Its desire was for Gideon. Its desire was for Gideon's sons, and nobody ruled over sin. Church, sin is just as deadly and dangerous today. The sins we hold on to in the dark fester into something that will destroy everything in its path. If sin is like a small serpent and you keep it locked away, the more you feed it, before you know it turns into a dragon and it will destroy your life. Our pride will hurt our friends. Anger will destroy our children. Arrogance will lead into loneliness, and self-righteousness will be like rot in the bones of God's people. You see, sin is not just individual, as this story tells us, right? Gideon's sin affected the entire nation, and most particularly his 70 sons. Abimelech's sins affected everybody that he came into contact with. This prophecy of Jotham, the prophecy of Jotham was that everybody involved would kill each other. That's what sin does. Without God's grace and without God's power intervening, if sin is left to itself, it's kept in the dark, if it's not ruled over, it will destroy everything. So what do we do? What do we do when it's so easy to hold on to passions of lust and addictions? What do we do when it's so easy to hold on to and allow bitterness to fester in our lives? It's so easy to be taken captive and be deceived by the promises that sin makes. You know, sin promises you all the same thing that Abimelech wanted. It offers you the throne of your life. It promises you the throne. It says, you can sit on it. It's yours. And we'll kill anybody and everyone that would seek to knock you down. That's what sin does. It's not very clever. It does this. It's a one-trick pony. Same thing that happened with Adam and Eve in the garden. You can be like God. You can be God. Just do this. And we keep falling for it over and over again. Sin so often promises kingship to you. It promises you the throne. Yet, like the bramble, it only delivers oppression and misery. So how do we do it? How do we fight against this sin? How do we rule over the sin that crouches at the door? How do we keep from going where sin wants to take us? Well, we cling to the one who has conquered sin. We hold on to the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate judge, the ultimate Yeshua, the one who has come and has redeemed us out of the power of sin. We hold on to the one that crushes the head of the serpent. We hold on to the one that redeems people from bondage. We hold on to the one that goes ahead of us and fights for us. We cling to our Savior, for he is the King who has defeated the great dragon. He is the victorious one. So we align our affections, we align our desires, we align our thoughts and our actions and our words with the King. This is what we do. We look at our lives and we take inventory and say, okay, what in my life is running a rebellious path? What is locked away that might be growing? And we go in there and we take it and we submit it to King Jesus, and he will kill it and resurrect it into something better. This is what he does, right? And this is what we help each other do. Because in the same way that sin is communal, it affects everyone, so is sanctification. So is the path toward holiness. We need one another. You will see things in each other's lives. You will see things in my life. I'll see things in your life. God gives grace to us in this way, that we help one another walk faithfully before him, thus ruling over sin, thus killing sin. This is what the Christian life is all about, going to war with sin so that the King might be exalted and glorified. And what tends to happen, excuse me, when the Bible talks about how Satan prowls around like a lion looking for one to devour, right? And the language there is used in a circular motion, like a lion walking around a herd looking for a gazelle to take down. And if you watch the Discovery Channel, the lions never just rush into the middle of the herd. They wait for that one to go out by itself, separates it from the pack, and that's the one that it takes down. This is what sin does. This is why we need one another. If we go out on our own into loneliness, we will be devoured. So God has given us his word, which is truth. He has given us his church, his body, that protects us and holds us and points us to the King. Therefore, for us to escape the power of sin, for us to rule over it, we must align ourselves holistically with the King who has conquered all. For he is our only refuge. He is our only hope. He is our Redeemer. He is the one that gives us victory and promises us eternal victory.